Bills. This is Toxic History.
Professor Julian Silverman. Professor Silverman received his bachelor's degree in atmospheric and environmental chemistry with honors from McGill University in Montreal, and a master's in philosophy and a PhD at the CUNY Graduate Center, researching conjugating lipids and carbohydrates to create safe and sustainable soft materials at the City College of New York. His postdoctoral work at the University of Kansas, he is currently teaching and performing research at the Fashion Institute of Technology. His first book, How and Why Soap Works, from RSC Books, is now available on Amazon and explores all of this and more. So thank you, Professor Silverman. With that, I'll hand the mic to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. And so this is a story you hopefully have heard parts about before. We're going to talk about Mercury, or Quicksilver, what I am calling the original influencer and timeless toxin. So mercury has been used in many forms since antiquity as a medicine, a cosmetic, and a poison. Today we'll explore its many forms and functions in consumer products, from things like ancient alchemical potions to precious paints, and of course modern skin whitening soaps, which are still on the market. Along the way, we're going to tell some different stories of people alive, dead, and also fictional, whose lives were permeated by this silvery liquid metal and its many different compounds. So we'll classify mercury containing hazards also alongside their distinctive routes of exposure. And we'll find that those two pieces, of course, really tell us how dangerous something can be. So to understand how mercury poses such a profound risk to human and environmental health, we're going to focus on its chemical behavior, coming from my background. Ultimately, it'll be that charge on the mercury atom, which really tells us how hazardous something can be and whether you can pour it into a liquid or suspend it in a lotion. So because mercury can be inhaled, it can be ingested or absorbed through the skin, we'll discover how different elemental, inorganic, and organic mercury are toxic in different ways. More often than not, mercury's toxic potential also kind of informs how we might remove it from the body through chelation. And this has all to do with its natural affinity for sulfur, and thus how it kind of binds and forms with natural minerals or enzymes and proteins. And so, to start, we can think of Mercury from different perspectives. There is, of course, our planet Mercury, which races quickly across the sky. It's the closest to the sun. And so the metal gets its name from the planet in that it mirrors its kind of restless nature, right? The Quicksilver, which moves quickly. And so in astrology, Mercury appears to move backwards in orbit, sometimes known as Mercury in retrograde. And it's said to disrupt things like travel and communication, which will lead us to the first figure that we'll talk about, well, I guess fictional in some sense, but the god Mercury, or Hermes. And so let's do it. Let's talk about the duality of Quicksilver. And so our first figure, Mercury, was a Roman god, or Hermes to the Greek, and was the messenger of the gods, so the protector of traders, travelers, and thieves, and also the conductor of souls into the underworld. So we sort of brought you along the way. In his left hand, you'll notice that he holds the caduceus, which is that staff intertwined with two serpents with the wings at the top. And this is what bestows upon him the power to induce sleep and peace and meditation, and also, again, grant you passage to the underworld. This is in contrast in part to Mercury the substance, right, which can destroy your nerves, cause insomnia, and of course lead to environmental damage. And so Mercury the metal was known to the Greeks as water silver or hydrargyrum, and that's what gives us the symbol Hg. Mercury is also naturally found in the Earth's crust and also in coal. So when we burn it, it can end up in the atmosphere. It's really rarely found in its elemental form and mostly found in compounds. So we will talk about elemental mercury, but also, again, its compounds as inorganic and organic. Essentially, in its elemental form, it's still used as an amalgam. So it can dissolve gold and is currently used in some dental practices, though, mostly superseded. And so a metallic mercury is most hazardous through inhalation. I love when I look at the SDS here, we know that it doesn't actually have an LD50. We'll talk about how it passes through the body as well. So uncharged metallic mercury is unreactive, and thus it can end up in the atmosphere. Part of the challenge here is that it can also circulate across the globe before it deposits. So even though it might be a local pollutant, it can end up in a lot of different places. And so what we find is that the charge of the mercury, again, be it 0 for the elemental mercury, +1 or +2, really influences the toxicity. So we have what are known as mercurous compounds, that's +1, or mercuric compounds, which are +2, and the latter tend to be more toxic. The challenge, of course, is that +1 can become +2, so again, it can, of course, do great chemistry. But once mercury has that charge, it's going to start to combine with other elements. And so, as I said, we're going to really talk about compounds today. So just seeing some of the different forms, this is just oxidation reduction. But I want to start by talking about the Mad Hatter. So, even though you might think of this as the elemental mercury, it was really the compound known as mercury nitrate, which was used as a corroding agent by hatters to treat the pelts and furs that they were putting on those fancy top hats. And so, mercury nitrate is water soluble. And so it forms a beautiful orange liquid when mixed with nitric acid and is put onto those skins or pelts to deal with the hair and other surface materials. And so inorganic mercury in this case poses a greater risk, typically through dermal exposure, right? These were practitioners working without gloves. And so a little bit less about ingestion here. But in this case, mad as a hatter typically describes someone who is rather eccentric or irrational. But there is also what we call Mad Hatter's disease, which is a neuropsychiatric syndrome caused by the mercury poisoning. And so from here, we're going to talk a little about paints and pigments. So mercury 2 sulfide, or HGS, is the mineral cinnabar, so found naturally. When processed, we can call it vermilion, that beautiful bright red powder that you see on the screen. This is a dense and opaque pigment, so it has a beautiful, vibrant hue. Unfortunately, it does darken over time as it begins to turn back to elemental mercury. So some of these paintings and lacquerware, if they're not, covered in a varnish, will begin to break down. This also poses a hazard, especially with museum workers, so conservators and restoration professionals who have to take care when they're, looking at a piece, they might not fully understand what's in it. And so from there, we have to see that mercury has been around really since antiquity. So famously used in China in elixirs taken by emperors, they were hoping that it would promote good health and longevity, where in actuality, it would really do the opposite. Used for many centuries, in a single century, more than 5 emperors died, right? So they had all of their right-hand men giving them these potions, and unfortunately, it didn't work as they wished. On the western end of this, ancient alchemical practices focused more on, transmuting base metals. So this was about how we might take something like lead and then use mercury to turn it into gold. And so we can see that historically, mercury was used both for health and wealth in different perspectives. And so, even though mercury does not get us to gold, at least in the traditional sense, there have been experiments where Japanese scientists in the 1920s did create gold from mercury. This is using like cyclotrons and very expensive equipment. So, do not invest in any companies claiming that you can go from mercury to gold, at least at a large scale. Interestingly, to go back one step, Cinnabar also kind of shows us how we clean up after a mercury spill. So metallic mercury loves sulfur, one of the themes of my talk today. And so if you have a metallic mercury spill, you can sprinkle yellow powdered sulfur on the surface, and it will actually turn into this pigment. Still quite toxic, but much easier to kind of sweep away. And so, by far the most important ingredient when it comes to some of our cosmetic preparations, we have to talk about inorganic mercurous chloride, or Hg2Cl2. This is an odorless white solid and earned the name calomel in about the 1600s and was used in the official pharmacopoeia in a variety of different preparations. So again, less acutely toxic than the +2 compounds. Mercurous mercury can oxidize to the more deadly state, leading to chronic conditions. But one of the things we find is that as we move through the centuries, that mercury was really seen as a panacea. So this was used to help cure things like syphilis, cancer, tuberculosis. And we have to talk about what's known as the blue mass, which was an official preparation of elemental mercury, honey, and marshmallow extract for some of these, challenges we faced. Two of these blue mass pills would have contained over 100 times the EPA recommended tolerable daily intake of mercury. And so, in some ways, the good news is that elemental mercury might pass through your system. But again, if it starts to change its charge, it can kind of seep in and begin to be, destructive in different ways. The founding father, Benjamin Rush, used to prescribe what are known as heroic doses. These were really meant to shock the body in place of the more, palliative and gentler methods we use today. Dr. Rush's bilious pills were also called thunderclappers, which is just a fantastic branding name. And these were popular laxatives taken by, the everyday person, but also Lewis and Clark during their expedition in the Northwest. So later on, historians were able to track their path in part by where the deposits of excreted mercury were in their campsites. So imagine taking about 4 parts of a blue mass and 4 parts of calomel that we were talking about with a single part of ipecac syrup. And that was a traditional treatment for malaria in the 1800s. Of course, not something we would use today. And so let's talk a little bit about how mercury works in the body. So after it enters the bloodstream, it's going to bind to those sulfur-containing amino acids like cysteine and taurine. There are different mechanisms, but in one of these, it might bind to portions of thioredoxin reductase, so again, an enzyme in your body. It's going to essentially prevent the restoration or creation of those antioxidants like glutathione, and then just have an overabundance of these active chemicals, which can then lead to oxidative damage and cell death. The good news is that some of these toxic effects can be reversible. So chelation therapies can be used for acute inorganic poisoning. So these would call on, again, sulfur in different compounds like dimercaprol or succimer to bind to that mercury and then essentially be excreted through the kidneys. And so we've talked a little bit about elemental mercury and a little bit of the inorganic mercury, but by far the one that, as a chemist, I'm concerned about is the organic mercury. And so we'll talk a little bit about how this is incredibly hazardous, especially through dermal exposure, contact through the skin. And so let me introduce you to what we call dimethylmercury. I should say that there are a lot of different types of hazardous organic mercury compounds. This is perhaps the most notable. A couple of the things you can see here are very low exposure limits that we're allowed to, be exposed to, but also that dimethylmercury is incredibly lipophilic, which is to say that it will not only easily enter into the skin, but also pass through. So this is formed by microbes in aquatic systems. So if elemental or inorganic mercury gets out through wastewater or other means, it is not only, changed to the organic form, but it also isn't really readily emitted by bodies. So it has about a 50-day half-life in the blood. And then the challenge here is that it becomes biomagnified across these kind of trophic levels or the food chain. So, for example, if you have a reasonable concentration in water, it can be almost a million times greater in predators like the fish that you end up eating. I'll tell you that in the New York area, there's a lot of concern about people who fish in the Hudson for PCBs and other things. But there have been a lot of sort of historic examples of where mercury poisoning is coming from, just the food that you need to eat. And so, even though I'm not an expert on that end, the recommendation is just always consult your local fishing, wildlife, and environmental agencies for safety guidelines, especially if you are, digging the crabs out of the mud or, of course, fishing as well. And so from here, let's talk a little bit about what happens when you are exposed to dimethylmercury. And so there are unfortunately many stories we can tell, but coming from the discipline of chemistry, we talk often about Karen Wetterhahn, who was a professor of chemistry at Dartmouth College. This was in the latter part of the 20th century, and she understood the challenges of working with mercury. She was actually studying how toxic metals interact with DNA and repair proteins, and she was using dimethylmercury as an internal standard as part of her research with NMR and MRIs. So, despite her familiarity, one day there were a couple drops of the dimethylmercury that got onto her latex glove. So, even though she was wearing the proper PPE, well, proper is maybe not the perfect term, because of its high lipophilicity, it's able to really permeate the latex and then enter the skin in only about 15 seconds. So, even if she had been aware of that quick mistake, right, there's kind of a short window to deal with this hazard. In about 3 months, she started to experience sensory disturbances, and then later cognitive decline. And even though she was being treated with aggressive chelation therapies, eventually she entered into a vegetative state and eventually passed away. And so incidents like this, of course, spurred organizations like OSHA to rewrite different protections, especially for those working in the laboratory. But there are, of course, stories on a larger scale that we have to tell. And so the one that stands out is, of course, the infamous Minamata disease, which was discovered in the Kumamoto Prefecture in 1956. Even though it was discovered in the 50s, of course, this goes back all the way to about the early 1900s. The Chiso Corporation, which manufactures different chemicals, began producing, I think it was resins in about 1908. And then the public in and around this area in Japan was consuming the fish, as you would do living on the coast. And so they were producing acetaldehyde using a mercury sulfate catalyst. And so this was just an intermediate in plastics and dyes, but the methyl mercury was a byproduct of this manufacturing process. And so Mercury acts as a catalyst for really the same reasons that the Greek god worked to bring people into the underworld. The Mercury atom has what we call a highly polarizable electron cloud, so it's kind of versatile. It moves back and forth. In the same way that the catalyst kind of allows organic molecules to come together and facilitate different kinds of chemical reactions. So unfortunately, in Minamata, the poisoning continued for decades. And one of the odd effects was also that the challenges were seen in cats. So the cats were seen to have what was known as a dancing fever. It was reported that they had these sort of acute neurological symptoms like strange gaits and other abnormal movements. They would howl, become blind, and also have seizures. And so this leads us to 2013 when they signed what's known as the Minamata Convention, effective in 2017. And as an educator, I try to teach my students about what works and doesn't. We can talk about, ozone depletion, which we've really begun to address, CO2, much less so. But it's good news that, for the most part, mercury has been removed from industrial and also consumer products, at least to levels that are relatively safe. And so here we are towards the last story, and we'll talk a little bit about cosmetics, which is really what my students focus on at FIT. So, mercury has really always held a role in cosmetics in part because it is a wonderful enzyme inhibitor. So it will inhibit the production of melanin and so essentially help whiten or lighten the skin. And so in some sense, it's really less cosmetic and more pharmaceutical, but inappropriately included in cosmetics and sold as such. And so, as I said, it kind of delivers not only rapid results, but it also addresses hyperpigmentation. It's also relatively cheap, which is probably the reason it's still used today and also easy to access. And so, even though it's promising this, sort of beautiful pale skin, long-term use can also create ochronosis, which is this kind of bluish-black discoloration, kidney damage, neurological issues, and, tingling at the periphery of your appendages. And so from here, let's understand how it really became popular as an ingredient in cosmetics. And so for the final person we'll meet, we'll talk about Dr. T. Felix Gerard, who sold his famous Oriental cream, which had the active ingredient calomel. And we can see here an older advertisement that was actually created by someone who purchased the brand from, actually, Dr. T. Felix did not exist. It was Englishman Joseph Trust who first started selling these creams in the 1930s. And again, you can't say that they didn't work. It's almost that they worked too well in some sense. These creams came from an original Italian recipe that were marketed with the phrase, "A skin of beauty is a joy forever." This was, of course, just one of many products that you would buy with other things as well. So this was like a depilatory cream and a hair tonic or a powder and blush. So you'd often use this as just the first step, sometimes with other kinds of occlusives that would then kind of lock the mercury into the skin. And so again, beyond lighter, paler skin, the product also would lead to darker rings, eventually even maybe loose teeth and tremors. And so products like this are really what led to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. They changed their recipe in 1936, probably aware of what was happening to their consumers. But even today, beauty creams, balms, and typically things made abroad can still contain mercury. So even things like antiseptic soaps. There are safe alternatives, things like whitening and brightening alternatives like niacinamide or vitamin C. They do work much slower, but they also won't make you lose your teeth. And so ideally, a cream would moisturize and maybe, again, keep hydration on the skin, provide a cooling, refreshing sensation. In this case, the original preparation for his Oriental cream had about 1/2 ounce of calomel in about 1/2 pint of water. And so more than anything, he was just charging you for water, which, is common across cosmetic and personal care products. And so again, at the surface of the skin, creating discoloration, dermatitis, but then also below the skin, those kind of bluish black colors, ulcerations, and neurological damage. And so even today, organizations like the New York City Department of Health put out warnings about cosmetic and beauty products that contain mercury. While focused on skin lightening products, they also mention soaps and other kinds of consumer goods. Generally, you should be aware of any kind of skin lightening product that might have a gray tint or color. Also, that doesn't list what the active ingredient is on the product label. And then the most interesting thing that you should also be aware of is that because it forms that amalgam with gold, if the bottle or container says that you should keep it away from gold or silver jewelry, that is a sign that you might have some mercury in there. And so from here, we can ask where we're going to go moving forward. And so earlier this year at the Fashion Institute, I was working with a student who was creating clear resin displays to show garments in a museum setting, and she was incredibly concerned about mercury in the formulation. Now, ironically, because of the Minamata Convention, we don't have to worry about it today, but she was being told by her supervisors, right, based on their experiences before the convention. And so we see that in some ways, mercury bioaccumulates not only in organisms, making its way up the food chain, but also in our minds, right? Mercury is one of those fantastic elements that kind of captures our interest. And so, beyond this, it's still a prevalent hazard, both in local and global environments. And so, in some, mercury is in some sense the original influencer, impacting how we look and feel, kind of like a TikTok celebrity today. But it also is a timeless toxin. We're not going to get rid of mercury. If anything, we should put it in its proper place. And so the story of mercury is still being written, but rather than try to fully ban the substance, we should really try to work with it and contain it in the proper way, be it for specialty manufacturing or industrial uses, or perhaps things like gold mining, where it works really well. And so mercury, as we said, has kind of changed its story across time, but it's part of, who we are. And as I mentioned, I explore the history of mercury soaps in my new book. You're more than welcome to check this out. Experiments you can do at home. And then this work is graciously supported by organizations like the New York Academy of Medicine and the Science History Institute, who also find that in their collections they have strange things, less so texts, but also artifacts with mercury in them. And so being aware of it is perhaps the most important part. And so, thank you, Adam, and thank you again for having me today. And I'm excited to hear our other two stories.